Well, good morning, everybody. Great to see you. So glad you're here. If we haven't met, my name's Steve. I'm part of the team, and I would love to meet you. So please come and say hi after our service. We're on week 2 of our series, Running on Empty. It's a Bible study in the book of Ruth. And the goal of this series is just to have an opportunity as a bunch of Jesus followers to have our spiritual tanks replenished, refilled. This time of year, we tend to be running on empty. I was watching some epic fail videos this week on YouTube. I know you would never do that, but I do that sometimes to feel better about myself. And one of the videos that I was watching was actually someone filling up their boat with fuel. So they pulled into the petrol station, they opened the little hole for what they thought was their petrol tank, they put in the nozzle from the gas pump, started putting petrol in, only to discover after they put in like $500, they weren't filling the tank with petrol, they were filling the boat with petrol. And then, on top of all that, this was actually in Australia, right? I mean, normally field videos are set in the US for obvious purposes, but this one was in Australia. Now, I don't normally take joy in seeing other people's misery like this, but this person could afford a boat, so they were going to be fine. But it seemed to me a great reminder of making sure that you fill the right tank. And that's what we're trying to do during this particular series. We finished last week by just learning, discovering, reminding ourselves that in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Ruth actually comes not after the book of Judges, but after the book of Proverbs. And it's actually considered wisdom literature. So Ruth is really an applied story of wisdom. Solomon pours out all his wisdom that God has given him from above. And then you've got this little love story called Ruth, which is really a way of taking wisdom and applying it into real lives, real stories. And so those of us who are modern Bible readers ask the question of Ruth, what does wisdom teach us today? Because we are called to be a people who live out wisdom in the world. Our study today is going to focus on the subject and the subjects, that's us, of God's love. So we're going to learn today about God's love. My wife celebrated her birthday last Monday, and whenever a kindergarten teacher celebrates a birthday, you know that there's going to be some very special birthday cards make their way home. So last Monday night, over a birthday Nando's, because we're super fancy and that's how we roll, Rebecca produced all her birthday cards from all her kindies, and we went through them all, and they were adorable and 100% cute, like absolutely amazing. Now, I just thought I'd share a couple of my favorites. The first was a card written to Creedy, not Mrs. Creedy, Creedy. And it said, "Dear Creedy, I love you. Thanks for all the snuggles." Like, how cute's that? So what you don't know is that Rebecca's pet name for me is Creedy. So now she's Creedy too. But I think my favorite was one of the children who wrote a card that said, "I hope you have the best Halloween." So I'm not sure that they understood the mission, but they did then draw a picture of Rebecca dressed as a duck, which was amazing. They're all so cute, but the bottom line is this: even though all these little kindies love Rebecca, they don't have the language yet to truly express how they feel. Back in 1956, C.S. Lewis wrote a letter to a young American writer offering the following advice. Don't use words too big for the subject. Don't say infinitely when you mean very. Otherwise, you'll have no word left when you want to talk about something that really is infinite. Whenever it comes to talking about God's love, the reality is we are all kindergarten children. We try to articulate the experience that we have had of His love towards us, but we actually don't have the words in our language, in our vernacular, to point to how potent, how creative, how generous, how powerful His love is. And language and culture are a challenge too. Because most people in this room, whenever we read the Bible, we read it in English. We think like moderns and postmoderns. We've had an approach to learning and scholarship in the world, which is all about dumbing everything down to make it simple and accessible. And that's great, but it removes the mystery and the glory and the incomprehensibility of the God that we proclaim to love and follow. In the Hebrew language, the word chosen to best represent the love of God is a Hebrew word, Hesed or Hesed. Hesed is a powerful word in the Bible, and what's really important for us today is that it's one of the most important words in the book of Ruth. In fact, in the story of Ruth and Naomi, the word Hesed shapes everything. Sometimes it's in the background and you're not really aware of it. Sometimes it's in the foreground and you cannot miss it. And as we study Ruth chapter 2 today, we're going to really be studying the subject of God's love. And what this story is going to teach us about the love of God, about the Hesed love of God, is this: God's love is always relational and always real. And it is never theoretical and fake. God's love is driven and loyal and goes above and beyond. That's what Hesed love is. One scholar said, Hesed is the gospel lived out. I love that. It's Jesus on display. Our English translators do their very best to translate Hesed for us English readers. They use words like kindness, mercy, loyalty, loving kindness. But the thing is, you can put all of those together and you still don't get to what we're trying to describe. A scholar called Carolyn Curtis James, in her book Finding God in the Margins, says this: Hesed is the way God intended for human beings to live together from the beginning. The love your neighbor as yourself brand of living. An active, selfless, sacrificial caring for one another that goes against the grain of our fallen natures. Hesed is a costly brand of love that involves going above and beyond what anyone has a right to ask or expect. It is the brand of love at work in the actions of Ruth and Boaz and ultimately Naomi too. Yahweh is the ultimate Hesed giver. The confidence and hope of God's people banks on the fact that Yahweh is abounding in Hesed. And the book of Ruth is given to us to put the Hesed love of God on display for all to see. You know, I'm not really one for showing off. Well, that's not true. Because in my heart of hearts, I love a good boast like everyone. Now, I'm very thankful that God has given me a social media manager in my wife. So before I post anything on Facebook or Instagram, I run it by her. And pretty much most of the time she says this: Steve, you can't share that because it just looks like you're showing off. And I squirm a little bit, but then I realize that she's right. Something inside of me wanted people, most of whom I don't know or will never meet, to think a certain way about me. Social media is weird, isn't it? When you think about what it does to us, it's so weird. Anyway, Rebecca says, Steve, you can't do that. You can't share that. It looks like you're just showing off. Our job as Christians is to put God on display, to allow the world to see him through our stories. The story of Naomi shows us how to do that, and so that's what we're going to learn about today. Is that all right? Okay, so let's dive into the text. Verse 1, Ruth chapter 2. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. And she had no idea, but God's Hesed love was working in the background, because as it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. The opening part of this chapter connects us to an ancient welfare system. In the same way that churches today have food pantries to help care for the poor and the marginalized, the nation of Israel actually had a law embedded into their operating system that safeguarded the welfare of foreigners and refugees and widows and orphans. It was called Gleaning. Essentially, it was the recycling program of ancient Israel. Now, Gleaning sounds like it's okay, But in reality, it's super hard work. And really what you're doing is you're picking up the scraps of the scraps. And you're likely not doing it alone. It's a very competitive environment. And on top of all that, when you're gleaning, what's on display is the fact that you are in public shame. Like you have reached the very, very bottom. I remember whenever we lived in Calgary in Alberta, Canada, there was an extensive recycling program. Like you didn't just get 10 cents on a bottle that you returned. Sometimes you could get up to a quarter. Like that's big money. So I saved up all our bottles, all our cans. Our garage was filled with boxes with all of our recycling. And I was super excited whenever it came time to take them to the recycling depot. I'd started to plan how I was going to spend the money. I was fancying a new pair of Beats headphones, or maybe a new iPad, or maybe maybe take Rebecca away for the weekend, and took all the recycling up, sorted through all the cans and bottles. It's gross and stinky and sticky. And whenever all was said and done, they gave me $35. $35. I couldn't believe it. I almost used that amount of petrol driving to and from the recycling depot. But what happened that day was that I gained a new empathy for Calgary's homeless population, who spend all day, every day, collecting cans from bins and streets. And it made me appreciate just how hard they work for so little. That is gleaning in the Bible. Unless we realize how much it sucks, we're going to miss how amazing the love of God is and the Hesed of God as it unfolds in this story. Let's go back into the story. So just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, greeted by the harvesters. He says, "The Lord be with you." And they reply, "The Lord bless you." So this is like one of those moments where the big man enters the room. We have a little saying in Northern Ireland when someone comes walking in, kind of carrying TVs is what we say. We say, "Oh, here comes the big man." And this is a big man moment. The big man enters the story. "The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you." All of his staff reply to him. "Who does that young woman belong to?" he asks. Now, if you remember back to last week, we introduced the idea of how Ruth's story is set in the context of patriarchy. And just in case you didn't believe me, look at that verse. Who does that young woman belong to? Women were property. They were owned by somebody. Who does that young woman belong to? The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now." Like, clock that for later on. She's been there since early in the morning, except for a short rest in the shelter. Now, this little tidbit of information gives us a glimpse into this amazing woman, Ruth. She is courageous. She is audacious. To care for Naomi, she has placed herself in a working environment that not a single one of us would choose. She is stepping into a place where sexual assaults are common, harassment for foreigners, racism is rife, leadership abuse, with harvesters being known for intentionally leaving very little for gleaning. Actually, while the law prescribed that field owners and farmers, they had to leave the corners for foreigners and for widows to come and glean. So that's what the law prescribed. But here's what's really interesting. It doesn't prescribe how big a corner is. And if you're anyway mathematical, you know that a corner can be very small and still be considered to be left for gleaning. So actually, this story is also a collision between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you." So again, this is a world where men needed to be told to be appropriate with women. That's crazy that all these years later, that's still the world that we live in. This was a terrifying work environment for this young lady to step into. He says, "I've told the young men not to lay a hand on you." And whenever you're thirsty, go and get drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" And Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." It's really interesting. I'm going to geek you out here a little bit, and you can zone out if you want to, but theologians actually call the story of Ruth a hero story. That's the language that they use when they're talking about this book. It's a hero story. But the mistake that we make is that when we read it in the hangover of patriarchy, is that we just assume that Boaz is the hero. He's the big man. He's the family redeemer. He's the generous field owner. He's the man in the story. He's the knight in shining armor. But this, however, is not the case, and it misses the point. Ruth is the hero in this story. Boaz is actually hitching his wagon to her, because what he knows of her is that she has connected her life to the Hesed, to the loving kindness of God. That's what he says in his testimony. "I have heard all about you, your faith, your story, what you have done, how God has worked in your life." And Boaz's faith is actually being inspired and stirred by Ruth's. Ruth is the hero. Women of Riverview, thank you for being awesome in a world that is not set up for you to be awesome. Ruth is the hero. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here. Have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up." In other words, bless her. See the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. Let's be a spirit of the law people, is what Boaz is saying to his workers. So that's what happened, and Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. So we're told at the start of the story, what time did her shift start? In the morning. And now her shift finishes in the evening. Then she didn't go home. She threshed the barley she had gathered, which is hard work as well, and it amounted to an ephah. She carried it back into town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. So here you have leftovers. First time in the Bible is kind of teaching us about the principle of keeping leftovers. Ruth didn't eat all her lunch, and she packed it up and she took some home for later on. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz." Now, this is so significant, guys, and I'll explain this in a moment, but I want you to see Naomi's response here. Remember last week what we learned about Naomi? She had theologically moved to a position where she believed God was her enemy. Her faith was dead, down and out. The tank was completely empty, and here is the turnaround moment. She says, "The Lord bless him." Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "He has not," speaking about God, "he has not stopped showing his," and the word is Hesed. "He has not stopped showing his loving kindness to the living and the dead." Then she added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." And then this is how the story finishes. Ruth says, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers,' like blessing upon blessing, until they finished harvesting all the grain." And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work with him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvest were finished. And then she lived with her mother-in-law. Wow, what an amazing story from Scripture. Awesome. So old, and yet so relevant. Ruth finished her first shift. No doubt the work was hard. Temperatures in Bethlehem that time of year, 30 degrees, no rain, sunshine all day. Now, I realize for a bunch of Western Australians, you're thinking, well, But that's hot in the Middle East. 30 degrees, unprotected in the field all day. And now the gleaning's done, and she packs up her lunch leftovers, and she goes home, and there's a mini interrogation from her mother-in-law. And the abundance of barley and grain and the revelation of Boaz led to a tectonic moment in the narrative. Something happened here that's so spectacular, and it's going to change history forever. And we're going to get into that in week 4. But here's what I want us to do with the time that we have remaining this morning. I want us to pull back, almost like we're flying a drone. You know, one of those cool drone moments when the drone shoots up and then the picture becomes bigger and it all starts to make sense. We're going to pull back from the story and we're just going to ask the question again. What does wisdom teach us? And wisdom in Ruth 2 teaches us about Hesed, about God's loyal, faithful love towards us. And I want to talk about how the book of Ruth teaches us how to put God's love on display in the world that we live in. So here are the 3 things I want to say to us. Number 1, God's Hesed is on display through our relationships. A kind of secret love of mine. Maybe I've told you this before. I love a good murder mystery. Anyone else love a good murder mystery? I love a good murder mystery as a TV show, but especially as a book. And I just finished the best ever one just this week. It's called Magpie Murders by Anthony Horowitz. Now, I don't want to give away any spoilers because if your spouse is a reader, there's your Christmas present idea right there. It was an absolutely exhilarating book, incredible book. And the author did something, so I'm not going to give any spoilers, but I've got to tell you this. The author did something unique that I'd never experienced before. They would hide hidden messages within their stories. There were acronyms and acrostics and words hidden within words. And what that meant was, as you read the story, you were like a treasure hunter, looking for treasure in every sentence and every paragraph. The book of Ruth is actually written in this way. There's actually hidden treasures in the book structure that if we don't slow down and pay attention to, we could miss them. And one of them is found right here in chapter 2. So in chapter 1, 10 years of life unfolds. If you can remember all the way back to last Sunday, 10 years all packed into one chapter. There's immigration, and there's death, and there's infertility, and there's all these things unfold. 10 years, one chapter. You come to Ruth chapter 2, it's like time stands still. One chapter, one day. And what is unfolding in that one day? 5 conversations. Ruth chapter 2 is 5 conversations. And then they're structured in a very creative and specific way. So conversation number 1 and number 5 are a conversation between Ruth and Naomi. Conversation number 2 and number 4 are a conversation between Boaz and his staff. And then at the very center, almost like it's an arrow pointing in, conversation number 3 is a conversation between Boaz and Ruth. A conversation that's going to change everything forever, always, for all of history. And we're going to get into that a little bit later in our study. But I think it's so incredible that such an important moment in the history of the world, such an incredibly important kind of redemptive moment in God's history as he plays out his story in the world, takes place through a bunch of conversations. There are no miracles in sight, no hocus pocus, no over-spiritualization, no manipulation, just conversations between people. Here, I think, is the lesson. God's Hesed, God's love, unfolds in and through relationships. Like, I don't know about you, but part of running on empty, I think, is because most of us are exhausted chasing after God. Whenever it's possible that he's right in front of us right now, working in very supernatural and spectacular ways just through the people that are in our lives and through the conversations that we're having. Number two, teaching point number 2 is this. God's Hesed, his loyal love, is on display when we act with courage and generosity on behalf of those who need us to. Last week, I finally got caught up on my first aid certification. I'd been dogging it for 2 years. I totally was trying to avoid having to do it. When I was living in Canada, because I worked as a fitness instructor, you always had to have your first aid. You always needed to be ready to go with your defibrillator. You needed to be well-trained and ready, because sometimes when you're working out, bad things happen. A friend of mine was teaching a spin class once, and somebody died in it. And his legs kept going. And so, you've got to be ready. But I figured, you know what? I'm not doing that anymore. I'm just a pastor now, and so I don't need my first aid and I don't need my defibrillator. But it turns out in Australia, to be a pastor, you need to bring people back from death all the time. It's part of the job. So anyway, I finally got my defibrillator training and my first aid. The story of Naomi, as it unfolds in this book, is the story of a lady who needs resuscitation. She considers herself a dead person walking. We're told in chapter 1 that her faith is flatlined and action needs to be taken. Ryan, I think, is the first aider today. Go get the AED, right? Like, this is what's happening. Naomi's story is over. Don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Myra. I'm not that person. I'm dead now. She needs to be resuscitated. And in chapter 2, the most amazing thing happens. Naomi is given the kiss of life. And did you notice how it comes to her? Through dinner and some groceries. The turnaround moment in her faith journey was some leftovers from lunch and some food for the week ahead. In the provision of food, Naomi's heart was touched so deeply that she remembered it. God hadn't forgotten her. God has said, had been with her all along. This is what she said, he has not forgotten to show his loving kindness to the living and the dead. He hadn't forgotten her. His Hesed had been there working in the background all along, holding on to her when she wasn't holding on to him. But amazing, right? That God's love was displayed through something so simple and so practical as a moment of courage, a lady going to work in a field, and a moment of kindness. Here's lunch. I think that's awesome. I think that's so helpful and so accessible for every single one of us. Okay, last thing I want to say today. Number 3. God's Hesed. You still with me, by the way? All right, cool. God's Hesed, his loyal love, is on display through a surrendered life. Now, to explain this, I need to take you back to last week, back into Ruth chapter 1, back onto the road to Bethlehem. In the Bible, by the way, amazing things happen on roads. And amazing things happen when people go for walks. So don't be afraid to go for a walk. Being on a journey is like a subtle plot line of the scripture. Jesus walked with his disciples on the road to Emmaus. The Apostle Paul was converted on the road to Damascus. And on the road to Bethlehem in Ruth chapter 1, a Moabite widow becomes a daughter of Yahweh. I don't know if you can remember back to the text of chapter 1. There's this tussle that takes place between Ruth and Naomi. I'm coming with you. No, you're not. Go away. No, I'm coming with you. No, I can't provide for you. You need to go back to your people, back to Moab, back to your family. You need to go find a husband. I can't do any of those things. No, I'm coming with you. And then this epic moment where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. What is happening in that moment? Well, what we can miss in that moment on the road is a moment of agency. Like, stay with me, because this is really important, and especially for the women in the room. Ruth was a woman in a man's world. And up until that point, Ruth had never been allowed to make her own decisions. They were made for her. Her family ruled her life. They decided her future. They chose her husband. And then he owned her. And he decided their future, and he made the decisions, and he set the direction. That's patriarchy, right? That's kind of how it works as a system. It removes agency from women. And on the road to Bethlehem, and we need to see the significance of this, for the very first time in her life, Ruth is given the ability by Naomi to make her own decision about her own future. Like, that's significant. That's awesome. That's God's Hesed in her life. She has agency. She gets to make a decision. And the first decision she makes in her life is to surrender everything to God. Did you see that? She's not choosing Naomi, and she's not choosing Moab. On the road to Bethlehem, she's choosing Yahweh. She's got one choice to make, and she says, I am choosing God. What is happening on that road is that this foreigner is becoming family. What's happening on the road is that this widow is being converted to the living God. Now, you and I, in the life after Christ, we understand, we've got language for this. We talk about this Spirit coming into someone's life, about them being born again, about them accepting Christ as Lord and Savior. That's how we process all that. But at this moment in time, what's happening is a foreigner is being brought in under the wings, we are told, of Yahweh's love. She's becoming a daughter. This is her conversion. And you and I get to see it. And it's beautiful and it's powerful. No longer is she receiving Yahweh's attention through a second-hand relationship with a lapsed Jewish husband or an angry and bitter Jewish mother-in-law filled with contempt for God. Ruth has had her heart opened, and she is choosing life with God. She's giving her future to Him. All that's going to unfold, she is trusting to Him. Church, there is something so powerful on display when we surrender our whole lives to God. When we give Him our future, when we trust Him to care for us, when we let go of trying to control every outcome and come in under the shelter of His everlasting arms. You know, as a teenage Christian, I used to surrender my life to Jesus every week. I'm sure you guys remember those days, every week. But you know what I forgot as an adult? To do that. And I can go for long periods, extensive periods in my life where I realize I am not living a surrendered life. And yet when we live surrendered lives, God's love is on display. For Boaz, the very moment the turnaround for him comes was when he hears Ruth's story. I have heard all about you, daughter. I've heard about your surrendered life. I think part of the challenge of having empty tanks isn't that our tanks are empty necessarily, but it's that they're often just full of the wrong stuff. In the New Testament, the writer to Hebrews says this: let us run with endurance the race that's set before us. Last week when we took communion, Ken reminded us that when you're an endurance runner, you need to be putting the right fuel in, because your body physically can only go for so long, and then it's just going to shut down. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. But it's really interesting that the writer says it's not what you put in that's going to fuel you, because Christ is in you, the hope of glory. The problem is all the stuff you're carrying with you. That's what's actually causing you to run on empty. So he says, you know what you need to do? You need to lay aside the sin that so easily entangles you, that weighs you down, and you need to fix your eyes on Jesus. It's just another illustration of a surrendered life. Leave everything go, let everything down, and run with your eyes on him. And so today, just as a gift from your pastor to us as a church, I just wanted to give us a youth ministry moment, an opportunity to surrender our lives to Jesus again, to come in under his loving kindness, to put our lives on display, showing his love to the world around us. Imagine a world that says, I have heard about you. I have heard about your surrendered life. So I'd invite you to stand. And let's just take a quiet moment with our heads bowed to just say, Lord, I'm giving you my life, my future, my fears, my hopes, my dreams. I'm bringing them in under your Hesed, your love, your kindness, your plans, your purposes. And I'm surrendering all to you, because it's one of the ways you want to show your love to the world is through my life laid down. So let's surrender ourselves to Jesus this morning.